Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think we are on. So welcome to this third installment of the Pierre du Bois lectures, which we hold at the Department of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute Geneva, which are named after a former professor, Pierre du Bois, at the department, who, as far as we know, is unrelated to the person that Adom Getachew will speak about today. So I use the English pronunciation for that name, which is W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm extremely pleased to have with us Adom Getachew today, who is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She's a political theorist, and she has her main interests in the history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and post-colonial political theory. And she's mostly known, probably to most of you, for a book that came out with Princeton University Press in 2019 called World Making After Empire, the Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. The book has won prizes. So many guys sometimes assume that Princeton University Press needs an editor to keep the website dated with the prize. I won't mention that now, at least not all of them. One is the Best Book Prize by the African Studies Association. Another one is for Affairs. It's also been one of the most cited books in recent years in 20th century intellectual history, I would think. It's a book about anti-colonialism and Pan-Africanism, so it deals with the history of thought, in particular several fairly well-known names such as Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, Eric Williams, but also W.E.B. Du Bois, about whom Adom will speak today. In particular, in relation to Du Bois's thought about the interconnection between empires, which in her book she calls international structures of unequal integration, empires on the one hand and the international system on the other hand. So I won't cannibalize more of your time, Adom. I'll leave the floor straight to you. Thanks for being with us, and I look forward to the presentation.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon and good morning for wherever you may be. The title of this talk is Disclosing the Problem of Empire in Du Bois's Political Thought. And this comes out of a project that I've been involved with my colleague Jennifer Pitts, also here at the University of Chicago. Over the last 2 years, we've been involved in a process of bringing together Du Bois's international writings, writings on imperialism, on anti-colonialism, on transnational solidarities, Pan-Africanism, writings that span really 50 years, a little over 50 years, in fact, from 1900 to 1956. So for those of you, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Du Bois, but Du Bois is perhaps the most prolific African-American writer, intellectual of the 20th century. And I think it's his international writings, which occurred often in the essay form, have largely been neglected in the take-up of his political and social thought. And the point of this volume and this talk today is meant to elevate that element of his thought. So what I'll be speaking from today really draws on his work around World War I and the 1920s. So I'll get started. In recent scholarship, World War I and its immediate aftermath have come to be seen as a pivotal moment in the history of empire and international law. On the one hand, the period is marked by the rise of self-determination and the emergence of nationalist movements across the colonized world. The forms of anti-colonialism associated with this period evinced an institutional flexibility, as yet uncommitted to the nation-state form, and deeply connected to transnational networks facilitated in part by the Communist International, but also a variety of other projects from Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism to Pan-Africanism. On the other hand, the founding of the League of Nations, once considered a watershed in the history of liberal internationalism, has been critically reconsidered for the ways it reproduced in imperial hierarchies. The result of these divergent trajectories in what Erasmus has called the Wilsonian moment gave way to the consolidation of the nation state as the normative institutional form required for membership in international society. The possibility that there could be different subjects of international law, races, mandated peoples, minorities, were gradually but decisively foreclosed. At the end of the Second World War, anti-colonial movements had come to accept the nation state as the counterpoint to empire. Even as the international order was dramatically transformed since this Wilsonian moment in the age of decolonization, we live in the world of nation states it helped to inaugurate. The picture of the world as composed of discrete and independent states still exercises a hold over our political imagination. This is an image in which the state is disaggregated from international relations, sovereign independence characterizes the relations of states to each other, and international organizations recognize the sovereignty through equal membership. The tripartite image of a domestic constitution, external sovereignty, and equal membership in international society obscures long-standing political and economic entanglements, the relations of domination that have structured the modern world. Writing in the decades when this image of the world came to be dominant, W.E.B. Du Bois in his international writings productively illuminates its blind spots and offers conceptual resources to move beyond its limits. Critical reflection on the problem of empire and a sustained attention to the relationship between the domestic and international realms of politics were persistent features of Du Bois's political thought, from his early articulations of the argument that the color line belts the world. Yet, as for many observers and critics of empire, the outbreak of World War I ignited in Du Bois a sense of urgency and possibility that required a new analysis of imperialism. In the account of the war's origins, and as a result also in the vision of a world peace embodied in the League, Du Bois encountered a studied unwillingness to take up the color line as a necessary context and condition of geopolitical competition and international violence. Du Bois practiced in this context a form of anti-imperialist critique that took as its aim exposing imperial relations and racial structures that were foundational to the modern world, yet hidden in plain sight. His anti-imperial writings can be conceived as strategies of disclosure, designed to reveal through new languages and metaphors and unexpected associations the workings of an imperial world that was increasingly described and represented during the course of his lifetime as an international community of nation states. Du Bois was not distinct among anti-imperial critics in elaborating new languages to grasp and represent the imperial world. If imperialism had developed discursive and ideological strategies to conceal and disavow its structuring presence and violence, anti-imperialism was always required new ways of making visible the contradictions and consequences of imperialism. Yet Du Bois's strategies emerged from the ways he cultivated a unique perspective as a Black citizen of the nation fast becoming the imperial hegemon. This standing inflected his strategies of disclosure as he spoke with and to a fractured audience of fellow anti-imperialists, fellow African Americans relegated to second-class citizenship, and to the nation of the United States as a whole. Speaking of himself as having, quote, a certain clairvoyance which is vouchsafed the outsider who lives within and the insider who does not belong, Du Bois combined the insights of metropolitan anti-imperialism associated with figures like J.A. Hobson with attention to the viewpoints of the colonized and racially marginalized. So today I want to examine how that tripartite image of the world, domestic constitution, external sovereignty, equal membership, is refracted in Du Bois's thought. First, the rise of democratic domestic regimes is revealed to be parasitic on the new imperialism of the late 19th century. Second, sovereignty appears as a veil that obscures this parasitism from within the world's powerful states, while shielding new forms of domination among weaker states. Third, in his engagement with international organizations, he built on these insights to illuminate how equal membership elided international hierarchy, while seeking to articulate an alternative internationalism that endowed non-state actors with voice and representation. So I'll take up these three in turn. So part one, democracy's imperial entanglements. In May 1915, less than a year into the First World War, Du Bois published African Roots of War, situating what appeared as an intra-European conflict in the wider context of the late 19th century's new imperialism. His argument that the causes of the war could be found in the competition over colonial territory in Africa anticipated the arguments of Lenin from the 1917 imperialism, while reviving a long-standing Republican critique of empire as a source of geopolitical destabilization. Although Du Bois's title suggests that this relationship between imperial expansion and war is his main theme, the conceptual innovation of the essay arrives in his answer to the question, what was the new call for dominion? Empire itself, Du Bois maintained, was not new. What was novel about the scramble for Africa was that it occurred in the context of democratization. In what appears as a reference to Alexis de Tocqueville, he notes, most philosophers see the ship of state launched on the broad, irresistible tide of democracy. For these figures, imperialism can only appear as delaying eddies here and there. For others, the persistence of hierarchy can only be explained as a reversion to aristocracy. Repurposing the Tocquevillian phrase democratic despotism, Du Bois rejects the blind optimism of the first position and the inability of the second to comprehend the depth and hold of democratic transformation at hand. Democratization of political, economic, and social relations was indeed ushering in a new age of equality, he maintained. Working classes gradually won suffrage and made slow but steady inroads into challenging economic inequality through workers' protections and trade unionism. Yet, the forging of democratic nations in Europe and the United States was made possible, he argued, by outsourcing the most extreme forms of exploitation and domination to the colonies or to racialized citizens. Unlike earlier agents of empire, the merchant prince, or the aristocratic monopoly, Du Bois argued the new imperialism was driven by a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. At work in Du Bois's account of democratic despotism are the multiple perspectives he inhabits and cultivates. First, by viewing the rise of the dominant modern state from the perspective of the colonized and dominated, he illuminates the economic and ideological bonds that held together the democratic nation. No mere sentimental patriotism, loyalty, or ancestor worship, but increased power, wealth, luxury for all classes on a scale the world has never seen before, had made possible colonial aggrandizement and was central to the democratic bonds internal to imperial states. Cementing this economic logic, every available resource of science and religion was brought to bear in solidifying the doctrine of racial inferiority. This reading of the relationship between the new democratic nation and imperialism can be usefully contrasted with J.A. Hobson's earlier account. Hobson directed his critical energy against the advocates of imperial expansion, who argued that it would help to alleviate the social question in the United Kingdom by offering new outlets of settlement, employment, and ensuring access for raw materials, needed for continued industrialization. In Hobson's view, this was merely ideological subterfuge, designed to conceal that the beneficiaries of empire were economic and political elites. Social democracy could only be achieved, he maintained, by turning the attention of the democratic nation inward to the question of redistribution. Du Bois, by contrast, indicates that democracy at home was less easily disentangled from empire abroad. The thesis of democratic despotism emerges from Du Bois's keen attention to the ways in which imperialism, as a necessarily global form, renders the bifurcation of domestic and international political development difficult to sustain. By attending specifically to a democratic imperialism, he makes visible the popular, material, psychic, or affective investments in empire, which become obstacles to building a wider anti-imperial movements within empire's metropoles. In the silent revolution, he writes, that has gripped modern European culture, the imperial spoils that sustained democratic society were in turn secured by white supremacy, a fabric of argument and sentiment that has worked itself through the warp and woof of our daily thought with the thoughtlessness few realize. Empire and the beliefs that made it palatable to ordinary citizens had corrupted the European mind, producing a deliberately educated ignorance and mutilated European sense of fellowship with humanity in its shared and inherent frailty. But while he pointed to the ways that Europe and the United States' new democratic regimes were parasitical on colonial and racial hierarchy, he did not see despotism as a necessary logic of democracy. Instead, he argued, democratic despotism was contradictory and unsteady, ripe for both analytical and political subversion. Du Bois sought to enact this subversion by realizing what he promised to be, what he believed was the universal promise of democratic equality. So it was by universalizing and globalizing democracy that one could overcome this structure of democratic despotism. Here, Du Bois's position as a metropolitan critic of empire, as a witness to what he called the most rapid advance of democracy in America, which goes hand in hand in its very center with increased aristocracy and hatred towards other dark races, comes to the fore. He sought to persuade a metropolitan audience that their democratic gains depended on their universalization. Du Bois maintained the chief hope lies in the gradual but inevitable spread of the knowledge that the denial of democracy in Asia and Africa hinders its complete realization in Europe. In this formulation, the combination of democracy and despotism was bound to undo the egalitarian thrust of European and American society. The vector of this erosion were the private actors and corporations whose political and economic power were enhanced by their role in imperialism. While the new imperialism, he argued, had been initiated by the democratic nation, empire always escaped democratic accountability. It generated new forms of monopoly, unleashed practices of coercion and authoritarianism that would soon return to the metropoles of empire. And the first victims of this imperial boomerang, he argued, would be the working classes, who had been cajoled and flattered into imperialist schemes, but would soon find their votes and voice gagged and rendered impotent. By making legible the deleterious domestic effects of imperialism, Du Bois advanced the argument that only the universalization of democracy can ultimately ensure its stability. Democracy, he concluded, must be made to encircle the earth. Part 2, Rethinking Sovereignty. Obscuring the dependence of democracy's stability on its universality was the conception of the Euro-American state as a sovereign entity. The image of the independent, self-contained democratic state hid from view its dependence on transnational relations of power, the exploitation of imperial subjects, and the global movement of capital. The sovereign European nation-state was thus, in a crucial sense, an illusion, its prosperity and political order inextricable from the global system. Du Bois deployed the metaphor of the world shadow to highlight this deep entanglement. With nearly every great empire today walks its dark colonial shadow, he maintained. The shadows are tightly appended to the European state, which can only be understood by likening and contrasting them with their dark double. To imagine Europe without its shadow was to see it only partially. If the sovereign European state was an illusion that occluded its imperial nature, the sovereignty of the handful of independent Black states was correspondingly deceptive, a plight epitomized for Du Bois by Liberia. The League of Nations' sole founding member state in Africa, Liberia, according to the ideal image of the sovereign state, was viewed as a self-steered craft, master of her own fate. When held up to this image of sovereignty, the only question one can ask about Liberia, Du Bois argued, is what is wrong with Liberia? A query which presumes that the ideal assumed to have been achieved in Europe is the possible horizon for the West African country. And when this question is asked, only one answer is available, and it rests on the idea of underdevelopment. This was the severest charge that modern imperialism brings against a small independent country, Du Bois argued. Du Bois makes three critiques of this developmental vision, extending the arguments of an early essay in 1904 called The Development of a People. First, the charge of underdevelopment, he argued very plainly, stems from racism. It takes no leap of imagination, he argued, to think that a country ruled and inhabited by Negroes is inferior. Second, this conception emerges from a narrow economic view of development, in which it is assumed that unless a nation is growing in numbers and annexing territory and increasing the amount of private profits, it is decadent. This is a vision of development that has foregone other markers of progress, which cannot be tabulated as growth. Finally, the developmental vision assumes that Liberia can replicate the trajectory of the United States and Europe. No attention is ever paid to the specificity of its founding, which coincided with the rise of economic imperialism. Du Bois seeks to reformulate the questions we ask about Liberia by offering different images of its status as a sovereign state. Instead of a self-steered craft, he argues, Liberia is a canoe, tossed on raging economic currents, which eddied out of the slave trade of the 18th century into the swirl of world war in the 20th century. These raging currents have helped fuel the dominance of Europe and the United States, who are the literal and metaphorical masters of the sea. Yet the conditions of possibility that assured Euro-American political and economic mastery make Liberian sovereignty impossible. Global capital backed by the power of imperial states who could not directly exploit land and labor saddled the country with debt represented as necessary for its economic development. Yet these same actors insisted that because the country was politically sovereign, its poverty should be attributed to its own internal failings, laziness, inefficiency, waste, inferiority, rather than to the terms of its economic and financial relations. Du Bois's writings on Liberia mark a clear transformation in his thinking about capitalism. And this is a transition we can see in other writings of this period. So while he had hoped in the 1920s that American loans and government contracts with the Firestone Company would provide a lifeline to the Liberian economy, by 1933, he reports he had lost his faith in capitalism. On the one hand, he hoped that the US, especially given its historic relationship with Liberia, and in response to African-American advocacy, could be persuaded to serve as a democratic counterweight to Imperial Britain, France, or Germany. On the other hand, he planned to persuade Firestone and the US government to employ African-American advisors and personnel who would be more sympathetic to Liberia. By 1933, both of these hopes had not borne any fruit. And I think we see here also particular attachment to a kind of elite-driven form of politics in Du Bois, which we can talk about in Q&A. In a mordant echo of the conceit that America was a city upon a hill, an example to the people of the world, Du Bois called Liberia a little thing set upon a hill. Here's another recasting of the image of sovereignty. Where the canoe is set against currents of global capital, the thing upon the hill is cast aside as the other of the image of political sovereignty. Liberia had tried to use its independence and its international legal standing to resist the grip of foreign capital. Its failure in this endeavor was not its own, but rather a reflection of the world's failure to constrain oligarchy. Liberia's fate was thus a portent of the future of world democracy. The little thing upon the hill serves in this sense as a warning about the limits of formal sovereignty and the dangers that lie ahead for colonized people. Du Bois also saw in Liberia an object lesson for African Americans tempted by separatism. Political independence was no solution to racial domination in a world unified by capitalism, in which the empire of concentrated capital will not let any group of people escape. So his response in some ways to the failures and limits of political sovereignty is to reimagine and rethink the international. And this leads me to part 3, reimagining the international. When the League and the United Nations was founded, Du Bois fully recognized both organizations' profound shortcomings as bodies of world opinion and their constitutive inability to address what he believed to were the true causes of global conflict: colonial rivalry, and the collective commitment in white societies to the exploitation of dark labor. As international organizations, they at once transcended state boundaries and depended on them. And their self-representation as communities of equal states belied their domination by the imperial powers, whose interests shaped the agendas and procedures of both organizations. Du Bois particularly drew attention to the unequal modes of representation that structured UN membership. It cannot be reconciled with any philosophy of democracy that 50 million white folk of the British Empire should be able to make the destiny of 450 million yellow, brown, and black people a matter solely of their own internal decision. Such a situation, he argued, amounted to the virtual enslavement of 750 million people who, like Black citizens of the United States, will have no rights that the white people of the world are bound to respect. So despite this deep critique, Du Bois for decades combined this kind of penetrating critique of the inherent deficiencies of both the League of Nations and the United Nations with a willingness to make what use he could of the structures and the languages they made available. Even as he pursued alternative forms of global political organization, especially through the 5 Pan-African Congresses between 1919 and 1945, the first of which he played a really prominent role in organizing. So despite this kind of attempt to create alternative sites and spaces of internationalism, he led appeals to the hegemonic international bodies, and in doing so, he pragmatically tempered his demands to their limitations. At the center of this strategy was an effort to reimagine the subject of international society, moving beyond a membership strictly limited to state actors and casting colonized and minoritized peoples as international agents with the right of petition and representation. Du Bois pursued this agenda with 2 aims in mind: planning for a transition of Africa from colonial subjugation to self-government, and reconstituting the oppression of African Americans as a matter of international consequence. Already with the formation of the League, Du Bois advanced these 2 aims. Accepting the premise that most Africans were not yet ready for self-government, he viewed the mandates system as a potential advance if it could be restructured through genuine internationalization of governance and a wider conception of representation. He thus rejected the assignment of a mandatory power and sought to introduce alternative actors to the international body. In his memoranda on the future of Africa submitted to Woodrow Wilson in November 1918, Du Bois proposed that a body of educated global Black public opinion be recognized as speaking on behalf of colonized Africans, pledging to ascertain by a series of conferences the desires, aspirations, and grievances of the colonized. The eventual league structure strayed far from his proposal for internationalization, and Du Bois sought once more to press for reforms through the Second Pan-African Congress in 1921. The proposed reforms, such as the appointment of a Black member to the Mandates Commission, were modest, and they also demonstrate that Du Bois maintained an attachment to a conception of elite rule, as well as some broad commitment to a developmental prerequisite for self-government. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Yet at the same time, these were efforts to insert new actors and procedures into international society. While League founders like Wilson had spoken of the consent of the governed, Du Bois sought to create fora in which the aspirations and grievances of the governed could be heard, even as his vision of representation hewed closely to an organic conception of community, one in which Black elites might properly count as the representatives of the colonized. In the imaginative intervention of introducing alternative voices and authorities, Du Bois's approach to the League was in effect very similar to that of Marcus Garvey, his political rival and critic during this period. Both sought to make the case for the Negro race as a non-state, extraterritorial subject of international society, one endowed with international rights and capable of self-representation in the world stage. This conception of the Negro race as an international actor informed Du Bois's efforts to internationalize the question of Black citizenship in America. In his second letter to Wilson in also from November 1918, Du Bois made the case that the subjugation of African Americans was a matter of international relevance, a plight equivalent to those of the Poles or the Yugoslavs being liberated from the empires of Central Europe. Du Bois clearly, this letter never received a response, and it doesn't appear from Wilson's archives, at least as we've been able to ascertain. But he valued this letter so much, mentioning it decades later in his posthumously published autobiography. It seems to be less an attempt to use international institutions in service of African American emancipation, and more a private appeal to Wilson to recognize the inconsistencies of his own position. Yet it is instructive in its mobilization of the nascent language of minority rights and the keen awareness of the mutability of the categories of peoplehood. The peace conference at Versailles is concerned with the rights of distinctive peoples, Du Bois argues, and a more distinctive people than the American Negro would be difficult to imagine. With the formation of the United Nations, Du Bois employed this idea that the Negro race was endowed with international rights to directly petition the international institution when he led and edited the NAACP's Appeal to the World petition submitted to the Commission on Human Rights as it drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the appeal's introduction, Du Bois describes African Americans as a segregated caste. What marks American Negroes as distinct here is not an absolute physical or racial difference from their fellow Americans, but instead a hereditary cultural unity, born of slavery, of common suffering, prolonged prescription and curtailment of political and civil rights, and especially because of economic and social disabilities. Alert to shifting international discourse, the call for international consideration of the oppression of African Americans combined an appeal to both minority and human rights. The petition catalogs the denial of human rights to the minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent. While the minority treaty regimes had been ineffective, They recognize collective claims outside the terms of statehood. And this is what's really important to Du Bois about minority rights. In the appeal and in efforts to expand the rights of colonized peoples to petition, Du Bois held open the possibility that collective actors beyond states can participate in the newly formed international body. At the same time, by mobilizing human rights, the petition deployed the still malleable discourse of the UN as a space of appearance for the NAACP and the American Negro more broadly. In this way, the very act of petitioning was a performance of a certain form of rights claiming. Since the early discussions of the UN's founding at Dumbarton Oaks, Du Bois had probed the question of how the UN could be transformed into a space of appearance for those living under the world shadow of imperialism. When European states appeared in that space as independent and equal states, their colonial shadows were obscured and erased. Du Bois sought to give voice to the shadows by endowing the colonies with the rights of petition and representation. As early as 1944, he argued for representation of the colonial peoples alongside the master peoples in the General Assembly. This representation, he argued, could take the form of voting membership or simply rights of complaint and petition, which should be decided by the Assembly itself rather than the great powers. He also called for the Mandates Commission, renamed at this time the Trusteeship Council, to have expansive powers to investigate colonial conditions and address complaints of colonial peoples. Finally, he argued that each imperial power must make clear and public its plans to raise the people of colonies as to a condition of complete political and economic equality with the people of the master nations. And this proposal, he argued, or it could take the form of both including the colonized as fellow citizens or ensuring their independence as free peoples. Now, Du Bois's view that empire need not culminate in a world of nation states was shared by many anti-colonial nationalists who articulated federalist and non-statist imaginaries well into the 1960s. Coupled with the expansive vision of petitioning and representation, the institutional openness was connected to Du Bois's efforts to conceive what he called a democratic internation. Unlike the United Nations, this would be an internationalism informed by the entanglements of the domestic and the international, the fiction of sovereign statehood, and the recognition of various actors and agents within the international order. The right to petition Du Bois demanded and performed through the appeal was not recognized at the founding of the UN or with the emergence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1960, the Declaration of the Granting of Independence, the colonial countries and peoples, secured by a growing number of new states joining the UN, finally managed to win an expansive right of petition for colonized peoples, creating the Committee of 24 and other ad hoc bodies to directly take up complaints and calls for investigation. This victory, though significant, coincided with clauses that reinforced the principle of territorial integrity. If the new right to petition opened avenues for non-state actors, territorial integrity narrowed its ambit to a particular kind of subject, colonized people subject to European alien rule. It may be the case that Du Bois's 1947 petition might still not have found little reception in this context. In any case, he had also shifted his own orientation by this point. Having joined the Communist Party, he settled in Ghana in 1961, where he would spend the last 2 years of his life. While not inevitable, the process of decolonization contributed significantly to entrenching the nation state as the dominant political form of international politics. Yet, even with the universalization of the nation state, imperial structures and racial hierarchies continue to subvert and circumvent the ideal of sovereign and equal states as the basis of world politics. Given the ways in which the image of the world of nation states continues to obscure transnational structures of economic and political power, ours is still a world that demands new ways of surfacing what remains out of sight. Contemporary crises, from the politics of immigration to the unsustainable burdens of debt that saddle the global South, require analyses that pierce through the bounded nation state. In emphasizing Du Bois's strategies of disclosures, the point is not to recommend his specific calls for reform, which emerge out of specific problem spaces and in response to specific animating questions. Instead, the point is to draw attention to a way of posing the problem of empire, one that is ever attentive to its obfuscation in our conceptual vocabulary and institutional arrangements, and that always begins from an attunement to the porosity of the boundaries that divide domestic from international. So I will stop here and take your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this marvelous talk, for being so conscientious about timekeeping and for keeping your internet connection so stable, which, as I showed everybody, doesn't go without saying. So I apologize for the hiccup in the beginning. It should work now. And you can all ask questions through the Q&A, where apparently you have a 512 character limit, but you can just pile them up one after the other, I suppose. So I give you a little bit of time to assemble your thoughts and pose these questions, but I already have a few coming in. And so, Adam, there's no need for you to look at them. I'll just put them to you in speaking to keep this more interactive, and in the end may add a few myself. All right, so the first question is from Nathaniel Powell, and he asks, did Du Bois see any difference between the character of American and European imperialism, or between different kinds of imperialism, for example, between Tsarist imperialism in Central Asia in a non-democratic state and, say, the French Republic in Africa, or did he consider these differences between them as marginal or functionally unimportant?
Great. You know, I think primarily his focus is on the Western European empires, and this has to do with his deep interest in the African continent, and those are the imperial powers that play a role. But even in that context, he has this essay that the language of the world's shadow and Europe's shadows comes from an essay called Worlds of Color from 1925. Which was published in Foreign Affairs, if you want to check it out. And there he differentiates between British imperialism, French imperialism, Portuguese. So he sees them not all doing the same kind of thing, not all generating the same kinds of possible solutions. So for instance, he takes really interested in the question of the French Empire's the possibilities for equal citizenship being perhaps more prominent in that context very seriously. So there's some disaggregation of those. The one time, you know, I think the other place where he has a sustained engagement with a non-European or non-Western European empire is in his writings on Japan in the 1930s. And I mean, these are a complicated set of writings in which he largely seems to, he has some critical comments about the Japanese imperialism, but for the most part defends Japan as a kind of counterweight to European empire. And his interest in Japan begins as early as 1900, and seeing it as the first space and site that kind of challenges white supremacy. So that's the place where you see, I think, kind of a more sustained engagement with another form of empire.
Thank you. Next question comes from my colleague Cyrus Shaik. He says, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I have 3 questions, which in Cyrus's case means you got off lightly. It's sometimes 5 or 8. Did Du Bois ever refer to the A mandates, and if yes, how? And he ends with the warning that he'll add more questions. And there's the second one. So you seem to posit a clear dichotomy between nation state nation states having full sovereignty and empire undermining it. How does this sit with concepts like empire by invitation? So, for instance, the US coming into Europe or being invited into Europe, or of alliance building between the United States and some late European colonial states and late colonial, post-colonial elites. That is, what do we do when some such elites are content to sign away parts of sovereignty?
Yeah, okay.
Let's maybe begin with the first.
Yeah, I can pick this up. So on the mandate system, he never really differentiates between the three categories of mandates. What he thinks should happen, which doesn't happen, of course, with the mandates, is that the governance of the mandate should be genuinely international. So there shouldn't be the kind of a provision of a mandatory power shouldn't be the proxy, and he takes that, as many others did at the time, to be simply kind of victor's justice. But he never, so in his conception, there would be really an international body that was in charge of governing all the mandates, A through C. But again, given the kind of preoccupation with the African continent, his primary when that internationalization doesn't happen, when there isn't a kind of direct league governance of the territories, he begins to suggest that one possibility is to expand the the people who sit on the Permanent Mandates Commission. He never makes a recommendation for someone who would represent the Middle East, where many of the A mandates were, but does so, makes that kind of recommendation for the African mandates. Okay, on the second question about the full sovereignty and empire and undermining it, I mean, the point of the talk is to say something like full sovereignty is an illusion, right? It's a kind of language we use to talk about the world of nation states, but one that doesn't really exist. It doesn't exist for the imperial states because they're kind of whatever their internal constitutions, economic and political, are parasitic on or dependent on this wider structures of extraction, and it's not true for the smaller states and for the colonies, because it's perpetually undermined even when they're formally independent. So I think what that suggests, and it's so that also I think means that the kind of aspiration for, I've written about this in my book, that many of the aspirations or thinking about this problem was that you needed precisely forms of regional coordination, integration, etc., and that might involve giving up parts of sovereignty. So I think the question is less, I think it's less like full sovereignty or no sovereignty at all, but not full sovereignty or no sovereignty at all, but the kinds of arrangements that are made, right? How egalitarian are the set of relationships? I think that would be one thing. I mean, I think you raise a second question, which is about elites, post-colonial elites, and whether they may engage in forms of whatever treaties, etc., that actually undermine the aspirations of political and economic development. This is not a question that Du Bois himself really thinks about. I mean, he has very few examples of post-colonial states. When it comes to, Liberia, for instance, he is very unwilling, I think, to critique the kind of the elites of Liberia, who, the politics of Liberia is very complicated, but the elites are the kind of they emerge out of Africa, former slaves in the United States who settle in Liberia. So there is a deep division between elites and kind of indigenous peoples, and he's quite, in part because he's trying to defend Liberia on this international stage, he's very muted about his critiques of the elites. So I think both this question and actually the earlier when I mentioned Japan, I think both of them in some ways illuminate one kind of limitation of Du Bois's language, right? And his kind of reoccurring invocation of the global color line, which I think, as I've tried to suggest here, is a really powerful, lens to reveal this kind of the workings of empire and the shadows. What it does, though, is like flatten the kind of structures of power, right? Makes them a bifurcated structure, and it generates this kind of, I think, less critical insights about structures of domination within what he would call the darker world. And I think there's both a way in which the defense of Liberia in certain ways and the defense of Japanese imperialism have that form. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. I take the liberty of joining two questions which I think are very similar and which follow on nicely right now from the previous one. So the first one is by Christian Jones, who asks, how did the history of decolonization in the Americas figure in Du Bois's political thought? I am thinking in particular of Haiti and the United States here and the continued entanglements between the two. And in a very similar vein from Ronald Roberts, who writes, absolutely brilliant, thanks. Did you come across any mention of Haiti? And I might add, I was also thinking of Haiti. So for instance, in interwar French Pan-Africanism and anti-colonialism, Liberia, Ethiopia are always mentioned together with Haiti.
Great. Okay, so Haiti. I think it's a really good question. I mean, there are some mentions of Haiti. I'm just trying to remember. There is no, so in the essays we've collected that are about 24, 25 essays from 1900, again, through 53, 56, there is no essay dedicated to Haiti in the way that there is, say, there are two essays on Liberia, for instance, in this period. Haiti does show up in a couple of places in his work. So in an earlier moment, it plays an important role in his dissertation work and his first book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, where he makes an argument that it's really the Haitian Revolution that inspires and generates the abolition of the slave trade in the United States. It's fear of Black rebellion, fear of growing presence of Africans after the example of the Haitian Revolution that generates that leads finally to the abolition of the slave trade. Haiti is mentioned in other places in passing, but again, there isn't a very sustained kind of engagement with Haiti in this period. Later, after reading C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, he writes an essay about the book, but he also writes an essay called Africa and the French Revolution or something like that. And it's written, I'm forgetting the years now, but probably in the 50s. It's written in this journal called Freedom Ways, which is where he would write after he was sort of kicked out of the NAACP and really a marginalized figure. And that essay again turns back to the Haitian Revolution as James does too, as a kind of model, as a kind of example for the moment of decolonization. But he himself doesn't write on say the occupation of Haiti in the interwar period. That is a central topic of kind of African American writing in this period. James Weldon Johnson writes an essay called kind of multi-part essay in The Nation called Self-Determining Haiti. It is covered in the Crisis magazine that Du Bois is editing in this period, but he himself doesn't write in any sustained way about it. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that, but I have to think, I have to try and think about why that is. Because I agree that in most other contexts, Liberia, Ethiopia, Haiti show up in this kind of linked way.
I take the liberty of squeezing in a question I had myself, which follows on from this, and then take the other questions which are in the chat, and it is about the United States as an empire. So you talked about Du Bois as a metropolitan thinker, right? Which implies that he sits in the metropole or in the heart of empire. I just simply wondered how much he uses himself the term empire in order to designate the United States, in particular, whether he ever talks about Puerto Rico or the Philippines, or how central this is. You mentioned it in the beginning of your talk that this is the time when the United States, becomes much more visibly an empire. But how important is this for Du Bois?
The first essay that opens this volume is it's a speech he gives in 1887. It's published in 1900. It's called The Present Outlook of the Darker Races. One of the things that, inaugurates, one of the pieces of that essay is like the Spanish-American War, the fact that the United States has now, annexed Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and what the relationship of African Americans to this new project of empire should be. So that's central to his kind of just thinking about when he's beginning to formulate the idea of the global color line in that early period. It plays a kind of part of his kind of landscape imaginary of what that color line will look like, and that the United States is now actively part of this kind of imperial expansion of the late 19th century. So that's one thing I would say. I think it also becomes a more pronounced feature. Does he use the word empire to describe the United States? Probably not directly. I mean, again, that the United States is involved in this moment of imperialism. But as the United States increasingly becomes like the more dominant in international politics, he has a lot to say about like the ways in which U.S. racial hierarchy is being either imported into the international, or he uses it as a way of critiquing the U.S.'s kind of self-understanding as kind of leader of the free world, etc. And I think there are two different moments in which this critique happens. One in the post-World War I period, a real critique of Wilson's rhetoric around American leadership, around the League. And then I think perhaps, much more powerfully during the Cold War period. I mean, a real critic of the Cold War, of U.S. kind of militarism and war making in that period. And again, with this eye towards how the U.S.'s global posture shapes and inflects domestic politics, undermines the space for critique within the country. Obviously, in this period, he's also persecuted, right? He's on trial, as a foreign agent. He loses his passport. So there's many reasons that the 1950s becomes a really important moment of critiquing American power. I mean, I think one part of America's empire that is largely absent from Du Bois's writing is, of course, America as a settler colonial empire and a country founded on kind of settler colonialism. So that, I think, it's rarely described or discussed as a kind of central element of what makes the United States an imperial actor.
Thank you. All right, I follow with the chat. So the next question is from Alana O'Malley, and she asks, at the United Nations, many African activists appropriated the ideas of Du Bois to innovate the system, but also to create new hierarchies of power within the African group. What was Du Bois's reaction, and what were the consequences for conceptions of sovereignty at the UN and the role of the organization in decolonization?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know what the first part of the comment is in reference to. So, Alana, if you could clarify exactly what you mean by, you know, the African, which African activists and which hierarchies within the African group.
So let's postpone the question, shall we? And I'm sure she'll get back to us in the chat.
Sure. I could just say, I mean, I think, you know, Du Bois really disengages from the UN after the appeal to the world happens, and he orients his attention to anti-war activism, anti-nuclear politics. This is what generates his trial, and the moment that he kind of returns to the UN space, or is when in 1960, when the resolution 1514 is passed, and when Nkrumah addresses the United Nations. So during that year, the pamphlet in which Nkrumah's speech is produced or is published includes an introduction by Du Bois. But he has, I think, less engagement really after the 1947 appeal. But I can, yeah, we can come back to it also after the clarification.
All right, the next question would be from Nathaniel Powell again, who writes, I'm interested by his early conceptions of what we'd later call neo-colonialism, since he died in 1963 in Ghana. Did he have any late life reflections about the early independence years of West Africa?
That's a good question too. That's a good question. There's less, you know, so yeah, by the time he dies, he's in his 90s, and he spends these last just 2 years in Ghana. I haven't come across anything from that 60, 61, 62 period. In this period, you know, he goes to Ghana on Nkrumah's invitation with the purpose of helping to write this Encyclopedia Africana, a project he had in mind for many years, and he's at not at the Institute for African Studies, but a kind of Academy of Sciences, Ghana Academy of Sciences, and he's directing this project. He's also writing under pseudonym many short stories. So I think there are, you know, we can see the kind of beginnings of a critique of neocolonialism already with the Liberia example. In the early days, when he, in his letter of, or like note of congratulations on Ghanaian independence in 1957, he does warn of the kind of dangerous limits of just a mere formal sovereignty, and argues for forms of kind of integration or internationalism, but not with a kind of clear conception of what those would be.
Thank you. All right, so and here's Cyrus's third question. How did Du Bois think about violence as a tactic and or strategy, especially from the later 1950s, what with Algeria becoming such a crucial model of decolonization, suggesting that violence is key?
Yeah, this is a good question too. Du Bois, I mean, consistently calls himself a pacifist, and this is true. He writes an early 1904 essay on this theme. He writes an essay called a book called In My Battle for Peace, which is about the trial. So he never fully advocates, violent revolution or writes much about the prospects of violence and the uses of violence in revolutionary politics. I think the idea of the color line is always has this threat, though, or this possibility of a violent confrontation, right? One that he hopes will be avoided, but one that he thinks is always on the horizon. So in the 1930s, especially in 1935, when Italy invades Ethiopia, he says, after this point, like who could, and this is connected to the Japan point I made earlier, who could argue with Japan that the only way to challenge white supremacy is by kind of taking on the structures of empire themselves and engaging in violent confrontation. That may in fact be, this is the one moment he really entertains the possibility that maybe a kind of violent seizure of power might be the only alternative to, or the only real possibility of challenging white supremacy. But I think so by the time in the 1950s and the 1960s, he's in his 80s and 90s. He's already quite advanced in age, and he's not producing as much. I mean, I think the interwar period is the moment in which he writes the most and writes the most about international politics. And in the 1950s, much of his attention turns to the Cold War and really to the kind of what he thinks is the kind of closure of political dissidents, etc., within the United States. So the kind of the international writings in that moment are turned to kind of thinking about the consequences of kind of Cold War posturing and politics for the United States. He writes in this period also a book called Russia and America that's never published. It's seen to be as a kind of an apologetics for the Soviet Union by the publisher, so it's rejected. But it's a very interesting examination and thinking about these two superpowers as having parallel histories and thinking about the ways in which there could be de-escalation of the conflict. So I think the anxiety about nuclear war, about Cold War in the period really shapes how he's thinking about war and still committed to some version of pacifism.
Thank you. All right, the next question is from another colleague, Bala Gopalan Balachandran, also at the Graduate Institute, who thanks you for your presentation and who asks, how would you situate Du Bois's internationalism historically vis-a-vis the condition of double consciousness? Are there moments when you think that he believes America still has too much to teach the world?
This is a great question. So, one thing I will say is there's been so much preoccupation with the language of double consciousness in Du Bois. It comes from his 1903 Soul as a Black Folk, which is the most probably canonized of Du Bois's writings. It's a language that never appears again in his own writing. Maybe ideas about it appear, but I think double consciousness is a way, it's, of course, he describes it as a distinctly African-American predicament, but he begins to think about Black identity and Blackness in different ways, especially in this period. Now, I think that the second part of the question, or are there moments when he still believes America has something to teach the world? I think he has into the 1920s a real sense that not America as such, but African Americans have something to teach the world, right? That they could be the kind of leaders or race leaders of the darker races more generally. And this also appears in that it's already present in that 1900 essay I mentioned, Present Outlook of Darker Races, which imagines that given America's newfound expansion, its incorporation of new dark peoples, that African Americans can play this kind of roles of pedagogue, right? We can educate and teach our fellow brothers and collectively kind of transform the United States, right? And that version also, you can see a tinge of it in the Liberia essays, where he's beginning to where he imagines that African-American leadership or African-American representation could somehow support Liberia, especially in its relationships with foreign powers and with capital. But I think the 1920s is a moment where this begins to shift, and I think the shift comes in his encounter with Gandhi, with Gandhi's writings, and with Gandhi's political program, right? So he thinks, and this goes back to the question of violence also, I mean, he thinks nonviolent mass action is a really transformative like intervention that Gandhi makes, and that what he particularly thinks is productive about it is, like he says, it's a form of action that anybody can do, right? It's made for the masses. And this I think the encounter with Gandhiism really makes a shift in his thinking, and he begins to think about the union of color as one in which African Americans might have something to learn from the rest of the world too, and from the rest of the dark world. You know, he writes a novel in this period called Dark Princess, a very oriental one, but the point of which is that, you know, the Indian princess is the kind of educator of the African American in that story. And it's through an encounter with her that he becomes politically radicalized and so forth. So I think that period of the 1920s reverses the imagination of political leadership among the darker races.
Thank you. All right, so and here's the clarification from Alana. She was talking about the fact that African leaders such as Nkrumah seized upon anti-colonialism and Pan-African ideals as a way to unite the African group at the United Nations. Later, however, as post-colonial elites emerged, there was great division around sovereignty to prevent the, in quotation marks, balkanization of Africa, which actually foreclosed the self-determination claims of some groups.
Yes, okay, great. I think this, yeah, Du Bois himself doesn't comment on this, and it's hard to say which side he would, you know, fall on, right? I think there are many parts of him that agree with the Nkrumah's project, say around a kind of developmental, modernizing ambition. There, you know, there is also, I think, so that would be one place where there's agreement. I think Du Bois also, in that, again, that letter of congratulations, he imagines, as Nkrumah does, these forms of relationship with the African continent, regionalism, integration above the national level, but doesn't write a ton about, you know, decentralization or the demands of subnational groups for various forms of autonomy, for decentralized federation, and so forth. There's a few places in the writings of the 1920s where he suggests, for instance, that you know, the village communities or even under the structures of indirect rule, there may be mechanisms and structures for accountability and some form of democracy within indigenous institutions that could be the basis for, you know, a post-colonial future, but never has a kind of sustained engagement with that way of thinking. Of course, this becomes really important for a lot of kind of anti-colonialists, anti-imperialists who are also critics of the centralized state, that there may be ways of thinking about indigenous institutions that reveal alternative futures, which this kind of centralizing ambitions of an Nkrumah and other state leaders, you know, actively resists. But Du Bois has this very brief glimmerings of that in some essays in the 20s, but never kind of has a kind of ongoing engagement, sustained engagement with that question.
All right. We don't have any real additional questions, but I may add a final one, though, being mindful of your time since you have to be somewhere else at past. And this is a question about nationalism and the nation state, since we're in the late 50s and early 60s now. So I noticed both in the book and in your talk now, you do call the actors that you write about anti-colonial nationalists. Yet you sometimes have these phrases, these anti-colonial nationalists did not necessarily want a nation state. And so for instance, in your talk also, the example of Liberia came across as an example that basically dissuaded them from the nation state model as the ultimate purpose. So I guess my first question would be, why do you call them nationalists if in fact in some ways you argue that they didn't even want a nation state? But the second question, which runs a bit counter to this, how come they so fast came around to it, if they had to, right? I mean, this plays a little bit into this whole Frederick Cooper and federalism discussion, but I sometimes wonder whether these federalist or federal alternatives weren't as much alternatives as they were, incremental or compatible layered sovereignties. And I basically wondered about your take on this.
Great, thank you. So, I call them nationalists because I think at the core, the question is still one of national independence. Like this is the aspiration, and the ambition of the book is to try and say, the point of which is to say they aspire to national independence, but it's precisely their aspiration for national independence that illuminates to them the kind of limitations of the nation state, and then the desire to move towards more possibly federalist arrangements. So the kind of hope there is to say that nationalism generated had a variety of outlets, could take on a variety of forms. And I think it's also to distinguish from people who were actually just critics of nationalism. I mean, someone put Tagore in the chat, but Tagore was someone who was an anti-imperialist, but deeply suspicious of nationalism, right? So I think more generally, the kind of ambition of my work is to try and reconstruct the kind of variety of combinations and modes of critique that existed in this period, in the kind of early 20th century, and then of course I think we would still have to account to what you're saying, which is why did those all disappear so quickly? Why did they all end up having to taking on this formation? I think that's a really big question, and I think none of the people, including myself, who've worked on these federations have a good answer. But I'll just suggest a couple of things that I've been thinking about since the book came out. One is, just to return back to Nkrumah and in the West African context, and maybe I'll bring in the Caribbean here too. So I think when in 1945 at the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, there's this kind of imagination that the kind of terrain of struggle in West Africa will be a regional one, that would be British West Africa. A lot of the kind of statements, articulations that come into that emerge in this period take British West Africa as the kind of region and the space, the physical geographic space of this anti-colonial politics. When Nkrumah returns in 1947, in 1948, there's huge riots and protests in Ghana, boycotts that have to do with a variety of causes, servicemen's pensions, rising prices of commodities, etc. And this generates a process of devolution, power devolution that takes Ghana as the unit. So by 1951, Nkrumah's new convention People's Party is running an election that's now about the territorial unit of Ghana. So this means that already before the before the independence, that territorial form gets baked into politics, baked into the Nationalist Party's politics, and some of the Nigerian critics of Nkrumah would say later, you want federation now, but you abandoned us and you took your own route in that early period. The same is true, but even more deeply so in the Caribbean. So universal suffrage is introduced in Jamaica in 1944. That means from 1944 to 1958, there is already a form of politics, party politics, elite competition, mass mobilization that's structured around Jamaica as a unit. So one thing I think is that just how the devolution of power in this period very quickly takes the form of the colonial boundaries, and for either because they don't think that for expediency, with the hope that they can revive the regionalist aspirations at a later date, a variety of Nkrumah and other actors agree to that as the basis of politics. So that's just one. I mean, there are many other explanations to give, but that's just one thing I've been thinking about since writing the book.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Adom. So I'm a bit mindful of your time since you have to be elsewhere at past, and you probably want 2 minutes at least to take a breath. Let me just take this one question still from Joram Spuller, who asks you about the relationship between Pan-Africanism and Pan-Asianism. Did Du Bois engage with similar attempts by Pan-Asianist ideologues such as Tagore? And if yes, what was his take on the strand of interwar global humanism preached by Tagore? And more broadly, did he situate Pan-Africanism in relation to Pan-Asianism? I promise this is the final.
Great. So I think on Du Bois was very interested in Indian politics and Indian political actors. So he asks, I don't remember the year, but he wants to feature Tagore in his in the crisis, and so he asks Tagore, could you send a biography and etc. And it gets published in in the crisis as a feature. The same thing happens around Gandhi. I mean, he has exchanges with Lala Lajpat Rai, Tagore, Gandhi, as I've said, he kind of, I don't know if they have actual written correspondence, but as I said, he becomes this really important model. And then Ambedkar in the 1940s. So India is the place outside of, I think, the kind of Black Atlantic world with which he is most engaged. In the 30s, he is asked by this journal out of Bombay called the Aryan Path to reflect on racial politics in the world. And he writes an essay called The Union of Color. And that essay is an attempt to think about, a form of solidarity that would combine, the Black world and the Asian world. So he never writes about Pan-Asianism itself, but kind of thinks about a form of kind of the solidarity of the darker races, which he articulates in that essay as the union of color. The essays, there's a response to the essay and he responds back. It's a very interesting exchange. It also raises these questions about violence that came up earlier. There isn't, to my knowledge, any place where Du Bois engages more directly with Tagore's philosophy and thought of this period.
All right, so I'll finish it here. I see a lot of thank yous in the chat. So people appreciated you making time in your busy schedule to talk to us. So do I. I think this was a fascinating talk. And I think it is very connectable to many of the interests in the audience. I also recommend everybody buy the book, World Making After Empire. There's a reason why Princeton constantly has to update their webpage for new prizes it wins. I hope there's a few more to come. And it was great having you here, Adam. Thanks for talking to us. It's always a bit dissatisfying at the end to suddenly end this and then everybody is out of the room, but it is what it is. I hope the format can continue at some point in person. Keep an eye on the Yes.E.B website, as there will certainly be more Pierre du Bois lectures in the future. So join me in thanking Adam. It was great having you, and I hope to speak to you soon.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the excellent questions.
Thank you. Bye.